We've had a little series going on over the last few shows of best quarterbacks by decade. We've had the 60s. We got groovy with it in the 60s, right? We got righteous with it in the 70s. Dallin, it's time to get bitching. Because this list is bitching. And on this week's edition of Mitch-Mo's Top 5 List of the Week, we're going to be doing the best quarterback of the 1980s.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about this at the beginning of this podcast, but I cannot wait to hear this list because I'm sure it is stacked with talent. This was a great decade for quarterbacks. And like you mentioned earlier, it feels like it's just kind of getting started with the 80s, and it's just going to pick up from here.
It is, yes. And you know what, Dallin, it's very apparent even right out of the gate. Before we even get into the top 5, the honorable mentions, because I think we set a record here with honorable mentions. Let's run through them real quick. Doug Williams, Boomer Esiason, Danny White, Randall Cunningham, Joe Theismann, Warren Moon, Bernie Kosar, Neil Lomax, Jim Everett. I mean, that's just stopping short. I mean, there were plenty of guys through the 1980s that had some sort of impact on that. I didn't even mention Jim Kelly, who started his career in the 1980s. Of course, his impact comes a little bit later, maybe a little bit of foreshadowing. But look, just a stacked decade.
Yeah,
is the 1980s. And Dallin, for the first time in the history of Mitch-Mo's top 5s, we have a 5A and a 5B.
Wow.
Could not pick between them. Could not do it. And then the 5A might surprise you. So let's start out with our 5A, John Elway.
Yeah. Wow.
John Elway is going to be my 5A. If you look at his career stats from 1983, the year he was drafted his rookie year, through 1989, 64-33 as a starter, over 2,100 yards, 120 touchdowns, 114 interceptions, had the Super Bowl appearance in 86, I believe. Look, his impact comes later, right? And so, like, though he played the majority of the 80s, his real impact does not come until later in his career. And so that's probably what puts him down closer to the bottom of the list, the bottom of the top 5. So 5A, we're going John Elway here.
Yeah, that's fair. That makes a lot of sense.
5B, I'm going Phil Simms. Phil Simms, quarterback, New York Giants, won a Super Bowl with the Giants in 86. So it wouldn't have been 86 that Elway was in the Super Bowl. I don't think, because I don't think the Giants played the Broncos in the Super Bowl. I'm sorry, I'm getting off track here. Phil Simms, 65-45 as a starter, 2,400 yards, over 24,000 yards as a passer, 143 touchdowns, 123 interceptions. You put him. You win a Super Bowl, you get in the top 5, right? If you win a Super Bowl in a specific decade, you become a top quarterback for that decade. That's just kind of one of the prerequisites to getting into this this hallowed ground, this short list of greatness. And though Phil Simms may not be considered an all-time great, he was one of the greatest quarterbacks of the 80s. So I'm giving the 5B nod to Phil Simms.
Yeah, I love that, Mitch. Also, you are correct. The Giants defeated the Denver Broncos in the Super Bowl 21 in 1986 season. So, yeah, perfect. You were correct. Don't doubt yourself. Come on, you know this.
I know. I'm sorry. That's silly at this point. You know what? It doesn't matter how much I cram into my brain. I still doubt myself, even when I just use something random out. I still doubt myself. I call it old man knowledge. Totally useless, but I guess it's useful for here. So
that's why we started the podcast. It's like, what else are we going to do with all this information?
Yeah, we have to spew it out somewhere. So I guess might as well be here. Number 4 on the list, an often forgotten guy, and I have to give him a shout out here. Dave Krieg. Dave Krieg was the quarterback of the Seattle Seahawks from 1980, actually through the entire 1980s, 80 through 89, 57-37 as a starter, over 20,000 yards, almost 21,000 yards passing, 169 touchdowns to 116 interceptions. Look, the guy was really good for not being a guy that's often remembered, and he created a lot of magic with Steve Largent in the 80s. Who a lot of people consider one of the, when he retired, he was the all-time leading receiver. So one of the all-time great receivers. For a lot of Seattle teams that at times weren't very successful, but still put up the big numbers. He actually led Seattle to their first 4 playoff appearances in franchise history. So I have to give the nod to Dave Krieg here at number 4.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, he was a 3-time Pro Bowler during the 80s, had a very strong run, and yeah, probably doesn't have the team success that a lot of these guys on the list will have, but individual success, yeah, I mean, he's up there. So I love that.
Yeah,
great mention there.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, Dave Krieg, he's got to get his ups. He's got to get his shout outs. Number 3 on the list, I'm going with a guy that would become a fixture in NFL analysts, a fixture in NFL commentary. After his career, primarily on CBS. I'm going with Dan Fouts. Fouts, number 3 on the list. Over 28,000 yards passing from 80 to 87. 172 touchdowns, 141 interceptions. He played in that Air Coryell offense that really just was one of the first offenses. Kind of like what we saw with the Air Raid when they tried to introduce it in Arizona when Cliff Kingsbury brought that system. That's kind of what Coryell tried to bring to San Diego, and it worked. It worked exceptionally well. Started with John Hadel, but then would go to eventually that role would go over to Dan Fouts, and Fouts was he was the big arm guy for his era. So Dan Fouts going to be number 3 on the list.
Yeah, I love that. You know, and Fouts is interesting because obviously he started his career in 1973, played throughout the 70s, but really doesn't come into his own and really find that big success until 1979, right about the turn of the of the decade. There gets his first Pro Bowl nod and then reels off, including that 79 season through 82. I mean, those 4 seasons, he's on fire at his peak, at his best, and putting up huge numbers. So yeah, right. I love that. That's a great pick.
And it was the first. He was also one of those guys too that, like, with the huge productive numbers comes the huge detrimental numbers as well.
Right.
I mean, massive interception numbers, but that was kind of the idea of the offense: is high risk, high reward.
Mm-hmm.
And he more often than not, took advantage of that situation. So
yeah,
Dan Fouts definitely deserving to be on this list.
I just he threw for 4,800 yards in 1981.
In 1981,
what?
Guys weren't.
That is wild.
If you threw over 3,500, you were considered God status in 1981.
Yeah, this
he
guy
was throwing for 4,800.
Yeah,
I mean that's
nuts.
crazy.
That's crazy. Like I mean, just that's a big number for 2023. If Justin Herbert throws for 4,800 yards next year, we're like, damn, he was slinging it. I mean, so to do that 40 years ago, that when running backs were still winning MVPs, that's crazy.
Exactly. Oh yeah. Dan Fouts, number 3 on the list. Number 2. And I struggled with putting him here, but the numbers are so good that I had to give him the nod. I have to give Dan Marino the number 2 slot.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And though he played the same amount of time as John Elway in the 1980s, Marino's numbers were just better. Mm-hmm. They just were, right? He had the 2 Marks, right? He had the Marks brothers. He had Mark Clayton and Mark Duper at his disposal in that offense, playing under Don Shula. The guy was he had the quickest release that anyone had ever seen in the NFL up to that point. Everything mechanically, physically, numbers-wise was just perfect about this guy. And coming out of Pitt, he wasn't really considered the best quarterback to come out of the draft. It was John Elway. He was considered to kind of be, the 3rd or 4th best option when he came out of Pitt because Pitt had a down year that year. So I think he threw more interceptions than touchdowns his senior year at Pitt. But what he was able to bring to the game as far as pure gaudy passing numbers is unmatched. 62 and 39 and it was his record throughout the 80s. Almost 28,000 passing yards, 220 touchdowns to 125 interceptions. Guy was ushered in almost the new era of the pure pocket passer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and burst onto the scenes in like a very almost like a Mahomes-esque way, right? I mean, his second season, he wins the MVP, 23 years old, throwing for 5,000 yards and 48 touchdowns in 1984. I mean, just
and gets to the Super Bowl.
And gets to the Super Bowl on top of it. I mean, that is Mahomes, like literally. That was like the Mahomes season. But yeah, I mean, it is crazy. Just immediately comes out of the gates and is lighting it up, and pretty much did that his whole career, obviously.
I mean, to put in perspective of like how good that 84 season was when he threw 48 touchdowns and then set the then single season record. The next year, he led the league in touchdown passes again and only threw 30.
Yeah.
I mean,
that's how he led the league in passing yards with 900 less passing yards.
That's how he was, like, how far outperforming he was everyone else at the quarterback position. It was something that they had never seen, and maybe we thought we would never see again until Patrick Mahomes showed up, and we have our generation's Dan Marino, but he just wins Super Bowls. So
hey, there you go.
That's
a very important caveat there. You know?
No jab at Dan Marino for not winning the Super Bowl, but he didn't get there.
Is that maybe why he's number 2 and not number 1? Is that as simple as it is?
It really is as simple as that. When of course it's Joe Montana.
Yeah.
Right, Joe Montana is the best quarterback of the 80s, and it's not even a close competition. Over almost 31,000 passing yards, so more passing yards than Marino and Fouts. 215 touchdowns, only was that 5 less than Marino, and fewer interceptions at only 107. He was a more efficient passer. He played in that West Coast offense, led by Bill Walsh. He had the greatest wide receiver, the greatest offensive player of all time in Jerry Rice at his disposal. He had John Taylor. He had Roger Craig. He had the defenses. He had the offensive line. He had everything around him to succeed, and he maximized what he was able to do with that team, winning 4 Super Bowls. So Joe Montana, by far and away, and that was the easiest of this is by far.
Yeah.
Actually, I started at 1 and worked down. When usually I start at the bottom and work up. I started at 1. And I said, okay, let's go backwards from 1 because Joe Montana is clearly the best quarterback of the 80s.
Yeah, I mean, he was the GOAT before Tom Brady, right? And rightfully so. And when you look at his career, I mean, from 79 to 94, so the vast majority of it came in this decade of the 80s, and that's when he had his most success. And I love for him, too, that it kind of culminates in his best season in 1989, where he wins the MVP, completes 70% of his passes on 386 attempts that year, and wins an MVP at 33 years old. And it's like to have had such a great decade, had so much success, and then still sort of end it with your best yet at that age of his career just goes to show how special he was. So I love it.
Remember when we were talking about Hank Aaron and consistency?
Mm-hmm.
Here it is for the football side of it. I mean, we talked about Dan Fouts throwing for 4,800 yards, Marino throwing for over 5,000. He was consistently right in the 3,500, 3,300 range every single year throughout the 80s, and still wound up throwing for more yards than the guys that had the gaudy seasons. The pinnacle of consistency. And I mean, the lower attempt numbers, the San Francisco 49ers were a run first team with Roger Craig. Mm-hmm. So this is just a testament to how much of a well-oiled machine the San Francisco 49ers were throughout the entire decade.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Joe Montana threw for over 30 touchdowns in a season just once. 31 touchdowns in 1987. So if that just doesn't show what kind of career he had and what he was known for, it wasn't these gaudy numbers. It was winning and accuracy. I mean, when you're completing 70% of your passes over a whole season, I mean, and he was consistently leading the league in completion percentage, well above 65%. So, Joe Montana, one of the greatest. So
one of my favorite Joe Montana stories is they're in the Super Bowl against the Cincinnati Bengals, and they're getting ready to go on a game-winning drive. And it's the biggest drive of the season, and everyone else is like on pins and needles, right? This is the biggest drive of the season, and Joe walks into the huddle, all cool, and he gets ready to call the play, and then he looks up and he goes, "Hey, that's John Candy." And he points over to the sideline. John Candy stayed on the sideline. He goes, "All right, let's go down and win this game." Calls the play. They go down. They win the Super Bowl. I love that story of just like how calm, cool, and collected this guy was.
Yeah.
Even in the highest pressure situation you could put a quarterback, he is just cool as a cucumber and gets the job done. Love it.
I love it. I love it. That's a great, what a great top five. We've loved this series throughout the summer as Mitch continues to break down the quarterbacks by decade in NFL history. But roll through your top five, or I guess your top six, 5A, 5B this week. So
Yeah.
roll through the top five one more time for the folks.
All right, so 5A was John Elway. 5B was Phil Simms. Number 4 was Dave Krieg. Number 3, Dan Fouts. Number 2, Dan Marino. And number 1, Joe Montana.
Yeah. Great decade, the 90s. That's going to be a strong one. Obviously, you brought up Elway already. You're going to have Favre. You're going to have Young. You're going to have Jim Kelly. You're going to that's 4 of the 5 right now. We haven't got to more names. So yeah, good luck.
I'm dreading I'm dreading the 90s and that decision making. Yeah. I can't even think about the 2000s right now. Like,
right.
That's going to be even worse. It's going to be even worse.
What a great